Russia-Ukraine war and Russia's aggression against Ukraine, its violation of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, and its denial of Ukraine's right to exist is a troubling precedent for the entire region. So I think those two processes, the corridor needs to be reopened. Then the other Zangezur corridor needs to be worked out. I also think, Turkey-Armenia relations are a component of this. The one positive thing over the last several months is I think we have been moving closer on that. What I think is important, though, is the United States is very far away. Americans have, we're concerned about a whole variety of issues. A lot of them are our own domestic problems. A lot of them are issues at our southern border. A lot of them are dealing with China. And so this is one of the many issues that the United States is dealing with. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And secondly, I think the answer to that is both. The United States has had a long interest and has long been engaged in trying to mediate between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis. That dates back to the Minsk Group. It dates back to President Bush's efforts at Key West. It dates back to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's efforts in the Turkey-Armenian reconciliation process back 12 years ago, 13 years ago now. That isn't directly tied, but it is a part of the broader reconciliation process in the region. So the U.S. certainly has a broad history of being involved. It has a close partnership and friendship with both countries. They're very different in how that partnership functions, but I would say we have pretty good relations with both countries and traditionally have. So I think we have seen over the past several years, particularly since the 2020 war. Yes, the dynamics have shifted. The Minsk Group is no longer the center of this. But the United States remains engaged. I think the Biden administration has increased its engagement over its predecessor, the Trump administration. Some of that is longstanding, the desire to have a stability and to sort of not have greater conflicts. The South Caucasus traditionally, there are regional conflicts, but when you look at the North Caucasus, when you look at the region below the South Caucasus, the broader Middle East, the South Caucasus generally has been stable for, minus, wars here and there, short wars for much of the last 30 years. The United States does not want to see another area destabilized. That said, Ukraine has added greater urgency to this process. Again, the United States does not want to see greater instability in this region of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. The United States views the South Caucasus as part of the broader Eurasian landmass. And the United States also recognizes that the Russia-Ukraine war and Russia's aggression against Ukraine, its violation of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, and its denial of Ukraine's right to exist is a troubling precedent for the entire region. We've seen over the past year, we've seen some Russians question Azerbaijan's right to exist. They've questioned Kazakhstan's right to exist. And they've even questioned Armenia, not the Armenian nation's right to exist as a nation, but an independent Armenia as it exists today, its right to exist and its right to have its independent agency in how it conducts its decision making. So I think Russian aggression certainly has unnerved the United States. We have stepped up our engagement over the last year because we do not want to see further instability growing. I think we also recognize that Azerbaijan has been using Russia's distraction and using the last year to be a little bit more coercive in both its military actions against Armenia and its diplomatic actions against Armenia. And so the United States does see a role in trying to mediate and trying to tone that down. Also recognizing that Russia doesn't have, the interests like it used to, and that Russia also is a very difficult partner for all of these countries, and it's a difficult partner for the United States. Well, first of all, I think Russia has long been able to take advantage of the frozen conflicts in the region. So while Russia has been, part of the negotiations, we also sort of see and has tried to play an even broker. Russia is really playing both sides. Is trying to cultivate Armenia and is trying to cultivate Azerbaijan. And it is a big part of the problem in Georgia. It is occupying Georgian territory. So we have all of that there. U.S.-Russian relations, Russian-West Europe in general relations have collapsed. They've collapsed to a level that I have never anticipated. They're the worst I've ever seen. I was in the U.S. government, 10 years ago when I thought they were going down the hill and becoming very bad. They're far worse now. And the worrying aspect of that is that all of the mechanisms that have been used by the international community and all the mechanisms that Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, in fact, have used to try to stabilize their countries and deal with both internal and external threats have atrophied over the last year or so as U.S.-Russian relations and U.S.-Europe relations have collapsed. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Russia does not play a real helpful role in that. It used to be a place where we could talk. It is pretty much no longer that. The Minsk group has fallen apart. And even, the Georgia Geneva discussions have also, Russia doesn't play a very positive role in there. So I think this is a very challenging moment. It's a very challenging moment for Russia, the U.S., and the West in general to sort of help in stabilizing the region. I really don't think Russia wants more instability on its border. I mean, I think Russia sees the Caucasus as a vital southern flank. The Russian North Caucasus is very volatile, and as I previously noted, the South Caucasus are one of the last buffers between Russia and the instability of the Middle East. And so I think neither the United States nor Europe nor Russia really wants to see any broad-based instability in the region. But what I think, I certainly see that Russian influence is declining in the region, and Russian capabilities. I think over the past year, Armenia has seen that. We've seen incursions into Armenian territory, and Russia is not able to do or chosen not to do much about it. We've also seen in the Lachin corridor blockade, Russia is the peacekeeping force that was empowered to do something to keep the peace there, and it's not able, its peacekeepers and its diplomatic pressure is not able to do that. So what I think, Russia, this certainly provides avenues for the West to come in and try to help. The West recognizes, though, that we can either be helpful, but sometimes being too present can also be detrimental, given some of Russia's reaction, particularly Russia's reaction to the deployment of the EU civilian mission monitor group in Armenia. I think Russia's reaction to that was way over the top. It was quite frightening, actually, and really questioning both the right of these monitors to be there, but also the right of the Armenian government to invite these monitors into their own country. So what I see is Russia, really doesn't want to work with the West in keeping this stable, but it does want to work with other neighboring powers, whether that is Turkey, whether that is Iran, whether it is anybody else. I think Russia has recognized that or probably recognizes now, and I think this is the reality, that the Ukraine war has really brought multipolarity. It's really weakened Russia's position throughout the entire Eurasian landmass, and that other powers, that could be China, that could be the Gulf states, that could be Turkey, that could be the European Union, Iran, are all increased, Pakistan too, in Azerbaijan, are all increasing their presence there. And Russia would, I think, prefer to now deal with the Turkeys and the Irans in trying to figure out how this region can be stabilized, and to keep the United States and others at a distance here. So I think it's very complicated and unlikely the U.S. And Russia can really work together. That said, there are processes going on both in Moscow, both in Washington, and in Brussels. And I certainly hope for the people of the South Caucasus, for the people of Armenia, for the people of Azerbaijan, I certainly hope one of those processes will prevent another conflict, because that is the last thing the people need. We've had way too much human suffering in and around the broader Black Sea region, certainly in Ukraine, but also this just comes 3 years, less than 3 years now, after the 2020 war. Well, I think there's a couple of things. From what I understand, from my conversations with Armenian friends, Armenians are tired of war, and they're scared about the future of their, not just Karabakh, but the future of the Armenian state in general. Whether that is threats from Azerbaijan, whether that's threats coming from Russia, questioning Armenia's right to be independent, whether that is Turkey. So I think. Armenians' position and the Armenian government's position is shifting. I always thought that Karabakh would Armenians would try to defend Karabakh to the end. I think Armenia is showing some flexibility on Karabakh. The big question now, I think, has moved from Karabakh to the Sunik / Zangezur, whatever you want to call it, corridor. From what I understand, there's numerous different ways that corridor could actually go. And Armenia and Azerbaijan can probably agree on that. But who actually controls the corridor? What sort of customs duties there might be? What sort of patrols? Who is defending the corridor? Both the Armenian territory of the corridor, but also the right of others to transit the corridor. Their safety needs to be preserved as well. And so I think the devil right now is in all of those details. The original proposal, which was the FSB, would control it. I think Armenia recognizes both Russia is perhaps not as capable in playing these roles as it used to be, and I think Armenia is questioning Russia as its alliance in general, because it hasn't paid off in the past year, at least for Armenia. Also, the fact that this runs right along Iranian border. I think what needs to be done. I think the two sides have been getting closer. I think the big question right now is the Zangezur corridor. And then tied to that, unfortunately, is also the Lachen corridor blockade. I think that has really put back the peace agreement and any potential for peace. It is highlighted to Armenians the threat that they perceive that's out there. It has highlighted Russia's inability to do much about it. So I think those two processes, the corridor needs to be reopened. Then the other Zangezur corridor needs to be worked out. I also think, Turkey-Armenia relations are a component of this. The one positive thing over the last several months is I think we have been moving closer on that. From what I understand, the talks are continuing. We've seen some flights go forward. I know Armenia did a feasibility study on opening up the border, was unsure whether Turkey had done that feasibility study. Well, we all know it. Turkey did do that feasibility study because they were able to open the border to deliver humanitarian supplies across to the devastated areas of Turkey and Syria after the earthquake. That all, I think, is positive. But at the same point, Azerbaijan is quite assertive right now, and Azerbaijan has a lot of control in and influence in Turkey. And particularly after this earthquake in Turkey, Turkish politics have been upended. And it's unclear how this next election will go. And what we've seen is that while there might be more openness generally on the Turkish side to Armenia, sometimes the influence uh, uh, can be, you know, can cause the Turks to pause a little bit. So I think this is there's three components to this. The first component is the Lachen corridor. I think if that's opened, then we can probably sort of see how figuring out how to do the Zangezur corridor, then figure out the Turkish aspect of this and whether Azerbaijan will try to stop any sort of rapprochement. And then after that, there needs to be some mechanism to guarantee the peace and some mechanism to guarantee the people who remain, the Armenians who remain in Karabakh, in whatever, however Karabakh will exist after that component. So there's really, actually, I said there were three parts. There's really four parts. That last piece is also going to be a big challenge. But I think we've moved closer than we have. I think in Key West we were close. We are closer now, but there's still a lot to be done. Well, first of all, I think the United States and Europe are working quite closely together. The United States firmly backs everything that Europe is doing, both on the negotiations front, but also on the border security front. And I think it's important, to have civilian monitors on that border, because it does add further costs to Azerbaijan, and it adds further costs actually to both sides to try to restart something. So I think the United States firmly backs what Europe is doing. We are in many ways walking, lockstep in that manner. And the United States and this administration, it has shown that together, Europe is sort of leading in some of these detailed negotiations through the Charles Michel process. But we have seen both the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the Secretary of State be actively involved in this process. And so I think the United States, as one of the biggest powers in the world, its role is important in pushing it over the line, backing what the EU is doing, and I think the United States also recognizes that Russia really resists too much of a U.S. presence in this region, and the United States doesn't want to do anything to further destabilize this region. So I think this is one of the reasons why the United States is there to lift the process ballast, to push it over the edge if that's possible, and the like. I don't think that Russia is quite happy with that. Russia still sees, in very 19th century terms, they still see the world as in spheres of influence, and it sees this region, the South Caucasus, Central Asia, Ukraine, the Black Sea region, as part of their unique sphere of influence. Former President, Prime Minister, President Dmitry Medvedev said that a decade ago. And so, I think Russia is certainly watching everything that the United States and Europe is doing, pushing back, and really trying to move the process, as I mentioned before, away from something where the West is involved to something where Turkey and Iran are involved. I think that's quite complicated, though, because the Azerbaijanis and the Iranians have their own lots of lots of historical baggage, mistrust, and tension. We also, involving Turkey, that also creates problems simply because of the Armenian Turkish issue. So I'm not, and China and the other players are really far away and probably not all that interested in getting involved in the nitty gritty of this. So I still see that sort of three processes. The U.S., the European processes; those are more tightly connected. The Russian process as well. But Russia has made clear that it wants to own the process. It wants to own this region, and is certainly trying to make it at least rhetorically more challenging for whether it's Western diplomats or Western civilian monitors, to try to play a helpful role. Well, I definitely see a huge geopolitical shift. I see a huge regional shift happening in this region. This region, generally, since the 1990s, has been oriented in three different ways. You've seen a Georgia, particularly after Mr. Saakashvili came to power, but even before then, with Mr. Shevardnadze, you had Georgia that was definitely looking westward. The population is looking westward, and the government was looking westward. We had on Armenia that, for a variety of different reasons, security reasons and the like, really oriented itself towards Russia, and Russia as both an economic partner and a security ally. And then I think we had Azerbaijan kind of hedging in between, knowing that at least economically, it was important to have ties with the West, given that was a major purchaser of Azerbaijani hydrocarbon. Also, the Azerbaijani-Turkish relationship oriented it to the West. But at the same time, its model of governance was more geared towards Russia. So Azerbaijan was really kind of hedging between the two. What I think we've seen is, as I said, Azerbaijan isn't hedging as much anymore. Azerbaijan sees itself in a superior position to both of its neighbors, and is trying to use Russia's distraction and Russia's limited capabilities. I mean, Russia is having a lot of trouble in Ukraine. It's not able to supply its own troops in Ukraine. It's not really able to help Armenia, even if and whether it wants to help Armenia is unclear. So I think Azerbaijan is being backed a little bit with Turkey, is being more provocative in the region, and is also willing to challenge Russia in the region. And I think we see that in the Lachen corridor. I think Armenia, on the other hand, is recognizing that Russia has not come to its defense. Armenia has didn't really, I don't think there were hopes maybe in the Nagorno-Karabakh war that Russia would, but Russia's military alliance with Armenia and with it covers Armenian territory. It did not cover the Karabakh territory. But what we saw over the past year was incursions into Armenia itself, and including Jermuk, which is clearly it's not disputed really by anyone. And so I think there's been some questioning, particularly after September of this year, about Russia and the alliance with Russia. I think also, many of the problems that Russia is experiencing today, it should have looked at what Armenia experienced a couple of years before: the command and control, equipment not working, difficulty supplying. So I think there's also questioning not only of Russia's willingness to be a partner, but also Russian capabilities to be an ally. So you now see Armenia sort of looking for other options. It might be too late, I don't know, but at least we see them reaching out to the West, to France, to Greece, somewhat to the United States. We also see them reaching out to India and other places to try to diversify its foreign policy and security options. And then we see Georgia, which is actually moving in the total opposite direction. At least the Georgian government is. The Georgian government, unlike Armenia's government is becoming far more authoritarian than it was before, and becoming much more friendly with Russia. That's the government. Now, I have no problem if Georgia wants to have good relations with Russia. That's Georgia's right to have good relations with Russia. But it seems to be, blaming Ukraine. It's claiming that the U.S. is trying to push Georgia into this war. They're attacking Western governments, Western partners, and clamping down on their own civil society in a way that we have not seen in many, many years. So as frictions grow between Georgia, which is no longer, this government, I think, is veering off its Western trajectory, the population of Georgia might still be there. But we're seeing growing friction between Georgia and the West. We saw that in the EU's decision to not grant them the same status as Ukraine and Moldova. And so we sort of see Georgia kind of in limbo. So we're seeing a huge shift. Georgia is no longer, the Georgian people, I think, are probably still wanting the European future. But this current Georgian government is not in the same place. We are seeing a vibrant, a democratic Armenia that solved its own political problems a couple of years ago after the war with the snap election, where you have a very vibrant civil society. That sort of on the democratic front, Armenia is certainly looking west, but doing so at the time where it's questioning its relationship with Russia. That, however, is quite dangerous. We know what Russia does in Ukraine. We've seen what Russia has done in Georgia, and the threats even just a few weeks ago against the Georgian people. And then we have Azerbaijan, which I think Azerbaijan's power is growing. Turkey also wants to use Azerbaijan to project power into Central Asia. Lots of the processes we are seeing in the Caucasus, with countries being rethinking their relationship with Russia. We're seeing also in Central Asia, and Turkey, just like it's being involved in the Caucasus, is increasingly trying to be involved in Central Asia as well. So I think Azerbaijan, it feels quite empowered. So I think those are all the areas. We've seen a tremendous shift. Azerbaijan is more empowered. Armenia is questioning Russia, trying to figure out what its future is going to be. And Georgia is moving in the opposite direction, is very much in limbo right now. And there's a huge political gap between the Georgian government and some Georgian elites and the Georgian population. First of all, I think the Ukraine war is the Caucasus War, the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict. It started at the beginning of the sort of the post-Soviet era. Now I think we're in the very end of the post-Soviet era, and I think the Ukraine war is the marking point of the post-Soviet era. We are seeing, as I just described, we're seeing huge shifts in sort of geopolitics. We're seeing shifts in how these countries are trying to rearrange their relationship with Moscow, with the West, with their neighbors. So I think we're very much in a different, we're entering into a different era than we were before, and I think we're entering more closely to the post Soviet era. What I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is tragic. What we saw in Karabakh 2-3 years ago was tragic. Everything that happened in the 1990s is tragic as well. I would have thought and would have hoped that we would have learned from that process. I am hopeful that both the Armenian and Azerbaijani governments will recognize the threat that greater instability is not something that this needs, that they need, particularly at a time when neither Russia nor the West could really get them to sort of to back off. And I sadly see some of the processes that we've seen. There's tremendous stereotypes, tremendous hatred, ethnic grievances, historical grievances that continue between the Armenian and Azerbaijani populations. That was not the case traditionally between the Ukrainian and Russian populations, but I think the sheer brutality of this war, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children from orphanages, we really sort of see some of that same. It's going to be the Ukrainian population, including the Russian speakers that in eastern Ukraine that the Russians are supposedly defending, have very much turned away from Russia. I think that is going to be a long process. It's going to be sort of stamped in history for a very long time, and it's going to vex the Russian-Ukrainian relationship for years just as this very tortured history between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey as well, is a problem in reconciliation and mediation prospects. I do see, at least the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians are talking. I think that's positive. For the Ukrainians and the Russians, there's really not a whole lot that they can talk about right now. I hope at some point that will be different. But what we're seeing right now is a very aggressive Russia and a Ukraine that's fighting for its survival, and we don't know how this war is going to pan out. There's a lot of unknowns, just like there have been unknowns in the Armenian Azerbaijan conflict, and I think the lesson is diplomacy, peace building is way more important. I think the United States, we do have a long history of trying to promote peace building, whether that's in Africa, whether that's in Asia, whether that's and I think some of those tools that we've used elsewhere might be applicable to the South Caucasus. I don't know, but I certainly hope that we as a government, but also we as a society, can play a role in peace building at some point. Well, first of all, I'll do the last. I mean, Azerbaijan has gained a lot through this blockade, but it's also cost itself a lot as well. Its image, particularly at a time when Russia is destroying civilian communities, using food as a weapon in its war in Ukraine. This really, this for the international community, using a blockade, starving people out, really is not it's not good for an image. The Azerbaijani government will say these are independent actors, but it's clear that if Azerbaijan wanted them to stop, Azerbaijan could. But I think also Azerbaijan is certainly showing Russia that Azerbaijan has leverage, an agency of its own, and can put Russia on the sideline Russia in ways that that are I would not have imagined a few years ago. As far as what the United States can do, I mean, I think the United States has been very vocal from the State Department level, from the Secretary of State level. We've heard some very vocal, also coming out of the White House as well. And there's pressure on Azerbaijan. I certainly would hope that the United States is also putting some more pressure on Turkey, because Turkey really is the interlocutor that has more influence in Azerbaijan. And the U.S. and Turkey, we have a very complicated relationship, but we are still allies. But I also think, beyond, and I think we've seen a lot of proactive things coming out of the new U.S. ambassador in Yerevan as well, trying to push on some of these. What I think is important, though, is the United States is very far away. Americans have we're concerned about a whole variety of issues. A lot of them are our own domestic problems. A lot of them are issues at our southern border. A lot of them are dealing with China. And so this is one of the many issues that the United States is dealing with. The United States public does not want any more U.S. troops deployed anywhere. I think they've made that very clear. Both after 20 years in Afghanistan, they made that very clear, and the U.S. is not going to get directly involved in the Ukraine. We might be supporting Ukraine, but I don't see troops getting there. So I don't see a deployment of any sort of U.S. help, and the U.S. is everybody turns to the United States to help deal with problem X or problem Y. So this is one of the many issues that the United States is dealing with. I think unlike others, it has been raised to the highest level, of the government. They're working on it. The Europeans are working on it. I know in all the calls that go on between Baku and Washington, and between Baku and between Washington and Yerevan, these issues are addressed and they're talked about. And we see statements, clear statements out of Washington that they view that the Lachen blockade, as I think it is pushing peace back. And I don't think it really helps Azerbaijan as much.